According to Western intelligence estimates, Vladimir Putin is prepared to continue the war until the complete capture of Donbass by the fall of 2027. And only then might a real window for negotiations appear, and even then only if the Kremlin still fails to establish full control over the entire Donetsk region. Experts assure that right now the Kremlin is calculating all resources and approaches to continue the war for another year, while in Europe they are determining who on their side will conduct future negotiations when it finally dawns on them. At the same time, the New York Post revealed the specific cost of these plans by Putin. July became one of the bloodiest months for Russia during the entire war. Nearly 43,000 Russians were killed or wounded on the battlefield in just 1 month. And the previous night, let me remind you, 600 drones were launched at Moscow and the region. The largest Wildberries warehouse in Russia near Moscow burned down. So, let's discuss in this episode the Kremlin's plans to continue the war, what's behind them, how Europe is responding, and whether Putin can keep the war going for more than another year. My name is Alexei Pechi, let's get started. But before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to this channel. We are moving toward the 300,000 subscriber mark, so I'll be grateful for each of your subscriptions. So, as the New York Times writes today, some Western officials believe that in the fall, after the elections to the State Duma of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin will still announce a new mobilization. It might be a hybrid mobilization, maybe recruitment efforts will intensify, but the fact that the Kremlin will be recruiting new Ivans for the war against Ukraine is already a fact. And others fear that the cornered Russian president might escalate with NATO and launch hybrid attacks in Europe to split the alliance. Sources from the publication emphasize that peace talks will become more likely if the Kremlin's goal of full control over the Donetsk region is not achieved. By that time, that is, by the fall of 2027. Against this backdrop, France, Germany and the United Kingdom are trying to secure Europe's own participation in future negotiations on Ukraine. And according to 3 officials, these countries believe that settling the war and future relations with Russia are too important for the region to leave solely to the Trump administration, which appears increasingly unpredictable. Britain, France and Germany hope to become the main European negotiators. They form the core of this coalition of the willing, supporting Kiev, and are already developing options and security guarantees for Ukraine after a possible settlement. According to officials, it is also necessary to consult primarily with Poland, Italy and the countries of Northern Europe. And the European Union should be kept informed and later directly involved in any negotiation process with the Russians. But this European initiative has a serious problem. It is the division within the West itself. Perhaps Europe's participation is complicated by disagreements within the West. Perhaps that some countries, especially those neighboring Russia and Ukraine, such as Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia and Hungary, they don't fully trust Germany and France to represent their interests. They say, listen, okay, there are 3 countries, but why should they speak on behalf of everyone? And you know, given Vladimir Putin's lack of interest in negotiations, the Europeans are still mistaking wishful thinking for reality. They've already, been planning for 2 years exactly how they won't negotiate with Putin. But first, he needs to be pressured, and only then should negotiations take place. At some point, it's clear that Europe must be present at the negotiations, because its security is under threat and is no longer considered a vital interest by Washington. But for now, Putin sees an advantage in trying to split the West and interact with Europe through the US. Well, for now, there aren't many chances. That's why Europe still needs to strengthen its own agency in this regard, in terms of putting pressure on Moscow. Meanwhile, Putin, I want to emphasize again, plans to gather the remaining forces and continue the war until the fall of 2027. At least, that's what European officials believe. But the war is becoming more and more expensive for Vladimir Putin. Actually, that's not quite right. Not for Putin, but for Russian society. Putin doesn't care. According to the New York Post, in July 2026, Russian troops lost 46,860 people on the battlefield. Let's put the word people in quotes, including killed and wounded. Why in quotes? Well, Russians, people, you know what I mean. This figure, almost 43,000, is the highest since January 2025, and it's the fourth bloodiest month since the beginning of the war, of the full-scale phase of the war in 2022. According to experts, the total number of Russian losses is approaching 1.5 million, and recruiting new soldiers is becoming an increasing problem for Putin. With a shortage of troops, he may soon be forced to either start peace negotiations or announce a mobilization. And next, I'll quote the New York Post. In recent months, Vladimir Putin has become so desperate that he had to lure his fellow citizens into the war with false promises of safe service in the rear, or recruit Africans using similar deceptive schemes. At the same time, Ukraine's defense forces continue to strike deep into Russian territory. Well, for example, on August 15, the armed forces of Ukraine launched Flamingo missiles deep into Russia, hitting the Savazlika airbase in the west of the country, 700 kilometers from the border. There, as a reminder, MiG-31 fighter jets are stationed, which carry Kinzhal missiles. Also, a Flamingo missile struck the Progress rocket and space center in Samara, one of the key enterprises of Roscosmos, 800 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. And here's a telling detail. This Progress rocket and space center produces Soyuz launch vehicles which are used in deploying the Russian satellite constellation, Rassvet, the very same one we talked about earlier in our episodes, which will allow Russia to attack all of Ukraine with drones controlled online. Basically, it's the Russian equivalent of Starlink. Separately, Kiev damaged the Ust-Luga oil refinery, which caught fire 800 kilometers from our border. Well, on the night of August 16, the mayor of Moscow complained that from evening until morning, as many as 600 drones flew toward the Moscow region, of which 201 were destroyed directly in the region itself. As a result of the attack, the entire Wildberries logistics complex in Kaledino burned down. This is the largest warehouse of this company in all of Russia, with an area of more than 200,000 square kilometers. And another logistics center was on fire in Domodedovo in the Moscow region. In particular, the fire broke out at warehouse number 15 in the Severное Domodedovo complex, one of the largest industrial and logistics facilities in Russia. Now, a broader analysis from Forbes on overall losses and rumors about mobilization in Russia. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, as of July 1st, Russia's total battlefield losses amounted to about 1.4 million military personnel. And only in 2026, the Russian army is losing an average of about 30,000 Russian soldiers every month. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the ratio of Russian to Ukrainian military losses is approximately 8:1. At the same time, the Institute for the Study of War notes that despite the huge losses, Russia was unable to achieve significant operational successes during the spring and summer offensive campaigns of 2026. The last time Vladimir Putin announced a partial mobilization was in September 2015, let me remind you. After that, Moscow tried to meet the military's needs with volunteers by offering high payments and tax benefits. But according to reports from Western media, voluntary recruitment has also slowed down recently. At the same time, experts emphasize that Russians' fatigue from the war does not automatically mean that these same Russians are ready to protest against Putin's policies. A March poll by the Levada Center showed that 67% of Russians consider peace negotiations with Ukraine necessary, while only 24% supported continuing military actions. But Russians are afraid to take to the streets and express their position. If all 67% of Russians took to the streets and demanded that Putin stop the war, it would have an effect. But Russians are not doing this. Why would the Kremlin even need mobilization? If Vladimir Putin decides to carry out mobilization, he will do it because he sees an advantage on the battlefield in doing so. He has repeatedly stated that Moscow wants to capture all of Donetsk and Lugansk regions. Russian successes in these areas have been extremely slow and extremely costly for several years now. So far, they have used a meat grinder tactic, meaning they throw as much manpower into battle as needed to try to achieve these goals. Perhaps the Kremlin believes that mobilization will finally help it capture these territories, although battlefield data suggests that this is unlikely. At the same time, experts generally believe that even a new wave of mobilization is unlikely to significantly change the course of the war. In conclusion, Western officials are now predicting that Vladimir Putin is prepared to continue fighting for at least another year, until the fall of 2027, counting either on military success or on a new mobilization after the parliamentary elections. The idea of the mad dictator Putin is that he will still be able to capture all of Donbass and declare it a victory. But at the same time, Ukraine is not just defending itself, it's already increasing the pressure. From territorial gains in southern Ukraine to the deepest strikes by Flamingo during the entire war, and massive night drone attacks, for example, on the region, the question is, which is clearly of interest to Europe itself, judging by its attempts to secure a seat at the table for future negotiations. But who exactly will be the first to break and approach that very window of opportunity for negotiations in the fall of 2027? But the troubling thought is that, you see, the next window for diplomacy is once again being pushed more than a year ahead. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.